What if I told you that one man, with just a few words spoken at a press conference, accidentally destroyed the American economy and caused the greatest financial disaster in human history? What if that same man was celebrated as a hero just months before millions of families lost everything they owned? And what if the exact same financial trick he invented almost 100 years ago is being used right now on your phone, promising you easy money? This is the story they don't teach you in school. The story of how one banker's dream of making everyone rich turned into a nightmare that lasted a decade and changed the world forever. If you love uncovering the hidden stories behind money and power, you're going to want to stick around. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the monetary archaeologist community. We dig deep into history to find the treasures they tried to bury. Now, let me take you back to a morning that changed everything. October 24th, 1929, a Thursday morning in New York City. The sun rose over Wall Street like any other day. Businessmen walked to work carrying newspapers and coffee. Nobody knew that by sunset, their world would be in ruins. In just 6 hours, Americans watched $14 billion vanish into thin air. To put that in perspective, that was more money than the entire country of Canada was worth at the time. Gone, just like that. 13 million shares were dumped onto the market in pure blind panic. The phone lines melted down. Nobody could get through to their brokers. People stood in the streets, staring at the ticker tape machines, watching their life savings disappear number by number. They called it Black Thursday. But here's what most people don't know. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't just market forces doing their thing. This catastrophe started with the decision of one single man. A man the newspapers loved to call Sunshine Charlie because of his bright smile and endless optimism. His real name was Charles Mitchell, and he was about to become the most hated man in America. Before we go back and understand how Mitchell created this disaster, let me show you what his actions ultimately caused, because the numbers are almost impossible to believe. The Great Depression lasted 10 brutal years. 10 years of suffering that scarred an entire generation of Americans. 25 million people lost their jobs. That means 1 out of every 4 working Americans was suddenly unemployed. Imagine looking around at your coworkers today and knowing that 3 of you might be gone tomorrow. 5,000 banks shut their doors forever. These weren't just buildings. These were the places where regular families kept their savings, money they had worked their whole lives to put away. When those banks closed, that money just disappeared. No insurance, no refunds, just gone. 2 million Americans became homeless almost overnight. Families who owned homes, who had jobs, who had done everything right, suddenly found themselves living in cardboard boxes in makeshift tent cities. People started calling these camps Hoovervilles, a bitter joke aimed at President Hoover, who seemed powerless to help them. Families with children slept in the mud. They stood in lines for hours just to get a piece of bread. Suicides went up by 30%. People who had lost everything decided they couldn't go on. The bridges of New York became symbols of despair, as men who had called themselves millionaires just weeks earlier chose to end their lives rather than face ruin. All of this pain, all of this suffering, and it started with one man who thought he was helping. So who was Charles Mitchell? And how did a single banker gain enough power to accidentally destroy the richest country on earth? Charles Edwin Mitchell was born in 1877 to a simple farming family in Massachusetts. There was nothing special about his childhood. No silver spoon, no fancy connections. Just a regular kid from a regular family. Nobody would have predicted that this farmer's son would one day control more money than most countries and change the fate of an entire nation. By 1919, Mitchell had climbed his way to the top. He became the head of National City Bank, which was the biggest bank in America at the time. This bank controlled $2.7 billion in assets. That was more than the entire budget of most countries in the world. But Mitchell wasn't satisfied with just being powerful. He had a revolutionary idea. An idea that would make him famous, then make him rich, and finally make him infamous. You see, before Mitchell came along, the stock market was a private club for wealthy people. Only about 500,000 Americans owned any stocks at all. That was less than 1% of the entire population. Regular working people had never even thought about buying stocks. They kept their money in bank accounts or maybe bought some government bonds. The stock market was a game for the rich, and everyone accepted that. Mitchell looked at this situation and saw opportunity. Every American should be a capitalist, he declared. Why should wealth belong only to the wealthy? It sounded so inspiring, so democratic, so American, and it would lead to complete disaster. In 1920, Mitchell created a new company attached to his bank called National City Company. This company had one simple mission: sell stocks to regular Americans. Not just the rich, everyone. He put his salespeople in 69 bank branches across the country. When ordinary folks walked in to open a savings account or cash a check, these salespeople would approach them with a pitch. But these weren't boring bankers in gray suits reading from scripts. Mitchell trained them personally. He called them dream merchants. They studied psychology. They learned how to tap into human greed and ambition. They knew exactly what to say to make regular people hand over their money. The advertising was unlike anything America had seen before. Newspapers ran ads saying things like, "Get rich by investing just $15 a month," or "Become a partner of American Telephone and Telegraph," or "Your children will be proud of you when you become an investor." Magazines published stories about ordinary people striking it rich. How a secretary from Ohio became wealthy in just 2 years. Streetcar driver buys his own house using only stock dividends. The salespeople had clever lines ready for every customer. They would say things like, "Mr. Johnson, you don't want to work for someone else your whole life, do you? General Electric stocks are your chance to become the master of your own destiny." Or they might say, "Mrs. Smith, your husband works for Ford. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you became a co-owner of the company?" National City Company offices were decorated with posters showing happy families standing in front of beautiful homes. The captions read things like, "Thanks to stocks, we bought our dream home." Everywhere you looked, there were smiling faces, expensive cars, well-dressed children. The message was clear. This could be your life. All you have to do is invest. But here's where Mitchell's real genius came in. And by genius, I mean the kind of clever idea that ends up destroying everything. He introduced something called buying on margin. Margin trading sounds complicated, but the concept is simple. And once you understand it, you'll understand exactly how the Great Depression happened. Here's how it worked. Let's say you wanted to buy $100 worth of stocks. With margin trading, you only needed to put down $10 of your own money. The bank would lend you the other $90. Sounds great, right? You could control 10 times more stocks than you could actually afford. Mitchell's salespeople would show customers the math. They would say something like, "Look, Mr. Brown bought $500 worth of Radio Corporation stocks, but he only invested $50 of his own money. 6 months later, those stocks grew by $150. His profit? 300%. Meanwhile, if he had left that $50 in a savings account, he would have earned maybe $15 in interest." People were mesmerized by these numbers. 300% returns? That was unheard of. It seemed like free money. The result was explosive. From 1925 to 1929, the amount of money Americans borrowed to buy stocks grew from $2 billion to $8.5 billion. That's a 425% increase in just 4 years. The number of Americans who own stocks jumped from 500,000 to 10 million people. Mitchell had achieved his dream. He had turned a nation of savers into a nation of investors. A teacher from Ohio mortgaged her house to buy stocks. A farmer from Kansas sold his cattle to invest in General Motors. A mechanic from Detroit put 6 months of his salary into Ford stocks. Everyone believed this was their chance to get rich. And Mitchell became a celebrity. Newspapers called him a financial genius. They praised him for democratizing Wall Street. In 1928, he earned $1.2 million in salary and bonuses. That's equivalent to about $20 million today. Magazines wrote about him as the man who made every American a potential millionaire. But there was a fatal flaw in his system, one that would soon become terrifyingly clear. Mitchell didn't stop with margin trading.
He took things even further. He created something called investment trusts. These were funds that bought stocks using borrowed money. Then these trusts themselves became companies that sold their own stocks. And people bought those stocks using margin loans. Do you see what was happening? It was debt on top of debt on top of debt. A pyramid built on borrowed money and held up by nothing but faith that prices would keep rising forever. By the spring of 1929, even the most optimistic economists were getting nervous. Stock prices were climbing faster than the actual economy was growing. Something wasn't right. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, started sounding alarms. The numbers they were seeing were frightening. Major companies were trading at prices that were 15 times their annual profits. Today, we would call that a massive speculative bubble. On February 6, 1929, the Federal Reserve issued a warning to all banks. Stop giving out loans for stock market speculation. The central bank demanded that margin lending be limited immediately. The market reacted right away. In March, stocks started falling. In just a few days, Americans lost billions of dollars. Panic was spreading. It looked like the bubble had finally burst. And then Charles Mitchell stepped forward and did something that changed history. On March 12, 1929, Mitchell called a press conference. Reporters gathered around, waiting to hear what the country's most powerful banker would say. And Mitchell spoke words that would echo through time. National City Bank will provide the market with all the liquidity it needs, he announced confidently. We will not allow an unnecessary crisis to occur. The effect was like magic. Newspapers came out with headlines celebrating Sunshine Charlie as the savior of the market. Stocks bounced back immediately. Within a single week, the market had recovered all its losses and was climbing to new record highs. Mitchell was a hero. He had saved America from disaster, or so everyone thought. What Mitchell actually did was inflate the bubble even bigger. He gave everyone permission to keep gambling with borrowed money. He told them it was safe. In the summer of 1929, stocks reached the highest levels in history. The Dow Jones Index hit 381 points, a record that would not be broken for another 25 years. 3 million more Americans jumped into the market in those final months before everything collapsed. Wives secretly pawned their jewelry to buy stocks. Shoe shiners were giving investment advice to their customers. Even children spent their pocket money on shares. People who had invested earlier felt like geniuses. Simple office clerks became millionaires on paper. Chauffeurs bought mansions. Secretaries bought fur coats. America was drunk on the illusion of endless wealth. But behind all this celebration, disaster was waiting. Here's the math that nobody wanted to think about. Every dollar invested in the stock market was backed by only 10 cents of real money. The rest was borrowed. That meant if stock prices dropped by just 10%, margin investors would lose everything. And if prices dropped by 50%, they would owe the bank more than they earned in an entire year. By autumn 1929, the smart money started getting nervous. Large institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, and banks began seeing warning signs that regular people completely missed. Industrial production was slowing down. Car sales were falling. Construction of new homes was decreasing. But somehow, stock prices kept climbing higher, completely disconnected from reality. Joseph Kennedy, who would later become the father of President John F. Kennedy, told a famous story. He said,
When the shoe shiner started giving me stock advice, I knew it was time to sell. And he did sell. He got out with his fortune intact. The big players started quietly taking profits. They sold their stocks in small amounts so they wouldn't crash the market too early. But by October, they had run out of patience. Some banks received insider information that the Bank of England was planning to raise interest rates. This would force the Federal Reserve to follow. And higher interest rates meant margin loans would become more expensive. People would be forced to sell. On the morning of October 24, 1929, New York's largest investment funds made a coordinated decision. It was time to get out. They started selling in massive blocks. Hundreds of thousands of shares hit the market at the same time. Prices started sliding downward. First slowly, then faster, then in an unstoppable avalanche. The system Mitchell had built was about to collapse like a house of cards. First domino. Falling stock prices meant banks had to demand more money from margin investors. When you buy on margin, if your stocks drop in value, the bank can demand that you deposit more cash to cover the difference. Second domino. But people didn't have extra cash. They had put everything into the market, so they were forced to sell their stocks to pay back the loans. This selling pushed prices even lower. Third domino. As prices crashed, stocks became worthless as collateral for new loans. Banks stopped lending entirely. Without new loans, there was no money flowing into the market. Fourth domino. Banks that had made too many margin loans started going bankrupt. And the first to fall were the ones who had followed Mitchell's example most closely. By noon on Black Thursday, pure panic had taken over. 13 million shares were sold in a single day, 5 times the normal amount. Brokers physically couldn't process all the sell orders. The telephone system collapsed under the weight of panicked calls. And then came October 29th, Black Tuesday, the final crash. In one single day, Americans lost $14 billion. That was more money than the United States had spent fighting all of World I. Behind those numbers were real people with real lives that were destroyed. Edward Hopkins was a mechanic from Detroit. He had worked hard his whole life and managed to save $5,000. Following the advice he heard everywhere, he put it all into Ford stocks. By November, those stocks were worth just $200, and the bank was demanding an additional $3,000 to cover his margin loan. Hopkins hanged himself in his garage. Mary Cranfield was a teacher from Ohio. She believed so strongly in the market that she mortgaged her parents' house to buy Radio Corporation stocks. After the crash, the bank took the house. 3 generations of her family ended up homeless. In New York City, lines formed not just at banks, but on bridges. The Brooklyn Bridge became a symbol of despair. Men who had considered themselves wealthy just days before ended their lives there. And what happened to Sunshine Charlie? In 1933, Charles Mitchell was called before Congress to answer for what he had done. Senator Carter Glass looked him in the eye and asked, "Do you consider yourself responsible for the ruin of millions of American families?" Mitchell's answer was cold. "I wanted to give people the opportunity to get rich. No one forced them to buy stocks." But justice eventually found him. In 1933, he was put on trial for evading $850,000 in taxes. He was forced to resign in complete disgrace. The man who had once been called the savior of the market became the symbol of greed and irresponsibility. Ordinary Americans hated him. One Detroit newspaper wrote, "Charles Mitchell stole more from us than any bank robber in history. A robber takes a bag of money. Mitchell took the future from an entire generation." Mitchell spent the rest of his life in obscurity. He moved to Europe for a while, working as a consultant for small banks. When he returned to America in the 1940s, he started a modest investment company. Nobody remembered him as Sunshine Charlie anymore. He was just an old man who represented the greed of a foolish era. He died in 1955 at the age of 78. He never once acknowledged any responsibility for the Great Depression. The disaster Mitchell helped create changed America's financial system forever. In 1933, Congress passed new laws separating regular banks from investment banks. The idea was simple. Never again would bankers be allowed to gamble with money that regular people deposited for safekeeping. New agencies were created to watch over the stock market. Bank deposits became insured by the government. Strict rules were put in place for margin trading. The government even took more extreme measures. In April 1933, President Roosevelt made it illegal for private citizens to own gold. Americans were forced to turn in their gold coins and bars to the government at a fixed price. Over 3,600 tons of gold were collected in just 1 month. America swore this would never happen again. But here we are, almost a century later. 50 million Americans now trade stocks on their smartphones. The volume of margin loans has reached a record $900 billion. Apps like Robinhood promise the same thing Mitchell offered: zero commissions, trade like a professional, invest your paycheck. A new generation invests in cryptocurrencies and meme stocks using borrowed money. Same promises of easy money, same cheap loans, same mechanism that Mitchell created all those years ago. The average American today owes more than they earn in a year. Margin trading has reached 1929 levels. And once again, millions of people believe that this time is different.
Charles Mitchell's story is a warning about how good intentions can lead to catastrophe. He genuinely believed he was helping ordinary people get rich. He thought he was democratizing wealth. Instead, his system turned the American dream into a nightmare for a quarter of the country. Every American should be a capitalist, Mitchell said in 1928. Everyone should invest, they tell us today. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it sure does rhyme. The next time you hear promises of easy money and calls to democratize finance, remember Sunshine Charlie. Ask yourself, who is really going to profit? And remember that the biggest financial disasters in history always started with someone saying, "This time is different." This has been Monetary Archaeologist, digging up the stories they don't want you to know. If this video opened your eyes, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. There are many more buried treasures to uncover. I'll see you in the next one.